Welcome back, everyone, to the Libertas International Podcast. This interview today, I just want to give a little trigger warning to start. You know, we do talk about some heavy topics, me and Christina, with some of the violence across the world, and just some really hard situations involving missing kids and missing people and mass graves, and it's definitely a hard listen, but it's definitely worth your time. Christina, I'm so excited we finally got to do this. Christina is one of the people that I admire most in this world. She's served a couple different roles. First heard about her from another survivor of trafficking who mentioned the name United Justice and working in Latin America, and so I was like frantically, looking up this person on Facebook and social media and like shooting out these messages, hoping that someone would get back to me. And Christina finally did. We connected, and I'm so glad. It's just an amazing human being, just has been an amazing mentor to me, a friend to me. She came down to down in Salt Lake where I was living at the time, and hung out for a few days, and I got to know her and took her to some really good diners, and just amazing. And her story is amazing. Like she'll talk about labels. She'll talk about just the stuff that she's gone through, what she's doing around Latin America, what she's done with other nonprofits, with the government, and what she's doing now to empower survivors in different leadership capacities. I cannot say enough good things about my friend Christina. I'm so grateful for her friendship. I'm so grateful for her support. I don't know where I would be in this movement without her, and I'm just so glad that she was willing to spend the time to do this podcast and really share some just amazing pieces of knowledge about what she's working on, what she's currently studying at Oxford, and how she incorporates what she thinks about the survivor movement within the movement, and how it's changed over the years, and ways that us nonprofits can help empower survivors, and her thoughts on organizations that are doing some amazing things and looking to incorporate survivors in what they're doing. I'm so glad you're listening. Christina Rengal is the founder of United Justice. You'll see the show notes of what she's doing, what she's accomplishing, her bio. Just amazing. Just an amazing woman. And I'm so glad that she was able to spend the time with us today. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to my dear friend, Christina Rengal from United Justice. I might just leave that introduction in because it's funny. But no, I appreciate you coming on the podcast, Christina. People that know me know you really well because I talk about you all the time and United Justice. And you gave me 2 items of swag a few years ago with like the sweatshirt and the black shirt. So people see it and they're like, "Oh, what's United Justice?" And the back, there's something in Spanish. And so when I wear it, in Colombia, people ask questions. And so I'm really pumped to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited that we finally made it work.
I know. I'm just so busy with your, I have all these things here on this list of, Oxford, your work in Mexico, Venezuela, with collaborating with other nonprofits, governments. Like, I'm sure we'll get into all this, but just you've got so much going on that I'm glad that we're able to find time to do this. But I want to start out just with United Justice. I know that United Justice is your baby. It's something that you're so super passionate about. I want to hear about the founding of it. Why did you start it? Why the name United Justice? And why are you serving the populations that you're serving? And then if you're good, I just want to kind of work my way down the continent, ending with Mexico, because I imagine you have a lot to say on Mexico, but working our way down South America and then coming back at the end to focus on Mexico.
Sure, yeah. So United Justice, yes. Oh my gosh, she is my baby for sure. Unexpected baby. I always say, oh, she's the surprise baby. Nobody was expecting. Yeah, I've been working in anti-trafficking a long time. I'm a survivor myself. And so I was trafficked in Las Vegas many years ago when I was young. I was 20. And when I got I don't know if we want to go into my story, which maybe you can ask me questions about later, but I actually ended up in prison. I did 2 years in federal prison because of things that my trafficker was making me do. So when I got out of prison, I spent so much time healing, and it was really a time that was like, what is trafficking? What is this thing? Is it really happening? There was like so much mystery around it. And so I got back into anti-trafficking work because it was like, It's really not that complicated. Like, these are the ones that are vulnerable. It's the exploitation of vulnerabilities. These people are profiting off of it. These people are involved. And, and I know through the years it's gotten more complex because there's a lot more exposure to it in the last 10 years. There's laws have changed, all of those things. But that's really what got me back into the anti-trafficking work. And so I worked as an advocate with the FBI for a long time, and I did trainings for law enforcement and trainings for the FBI and other types of like judges, prosecutors, social workers, probation officers, all of those kinds of things. And through that process, I really saw a gaping hole of resources for immigrant victims within the United States. And so I really started praying about and thinking, man, we need all this stuff in Spanish. Like, I feel like I'm such an advocate for I'm like, yeah, but do you have it in Spanish? Do you have it in Spanish? And so I kept thinking we need all of the resources and everything that we have in Spanish, but we also really need specific resources for them because they don't speak the language. Maybe they don't have documents, or their parents don't have documents. They don't understand the system. They don't understand how to get help. They don't know how to reach out for help. And so really United Justice was started because of that. It was really like, okay, I want to build a specific resource for this demographic of people within the United States that are being completely missed. But through the process, as you know, of starting a nonprofit, it's like so much paperwork and it's such a long process with the IRS and everything, that I started learning about the migration crisis that was happening in Venezuela. And so a friend and I decided to go down there just to Cucuta, to the Colombian Venezuela border, to just see if it was really as bad as the news was saying. Was like these YouTube videos, was it really that bad, or it wasn't that bad? And actually when we got down there, it was just 100 times worse than we could have ever imagined. There were so many women and children leaving. Now this is in 2018. So this is when the crisis was really, just overwhelming. It was, I think we met with the Red Cross on the border and ACNUR, the UNHCR on the border, and they were telling us that like 25,000 Venezuelans crossed through that border into Colombia every single day. And so this was at like the height of this, and the majority of them were women and children because they were desperate. And so we really looked at it like, this is a humanitarian crisis. It's also a trafficking crisis because it's going to be so easy to recruit these young teenage girls and these women that are desperate for jobs, for food, for stability, for housing. And so that's when we took United Justice and kind of changed the direction from like focusing on immigrant communities within the United States down to building a resource in Venezuela, Colombia, and then eventually Ecuador as well. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, that's perfect. That's exactly what I was looking for. My next question was going to ask you about Venezuela. There's a podcast that we released a couple weeks ago called "The Man Named Frankenstein," and it talks about this girl's journey that we're working with. And she actually texted me this morning. She showed me like her Halloween costume, and she looks adorable. But we talk about like the Venezuelan crisis, the political crisis, and how she ended up as an immigrant in Colombia, and how people use that to exploit her. And her story of just like a microcosm of everything that's happening, across Latin America with even now like the Venezuelan gangs that are coming out and trafficking Venezuelan women like all over Peru and in Chile and all these different places. And I had the privilege just, to verify like what you guys are doing, to go down with Belen to Cucuta and and I'd never been there. Most of my work is not in Cucuta. And it was just exactly as you're describing, like, especially at night, it's just a different world. And it's just like masses of people, like the
overwhelming
country. Yeah. Like there's so many groups that try to just provide immediate care or give them something like on their way to help with just ease their burden as they head to Santiago or Bogota or wherever they're going. So like working in Venezuela, like my first question is like, how do you do it? Like, how do you get money in? Like, how do you help? Because I'm also wrestling with this as well as some of our survivors that go back to Venezuela. How do you create something sustainable in a place where sustainability is not anything that they're familiar with and not anything that's probably coming in the future, with elections coming next year and that same guy is going to win Like, so how do you empower survivors? How do you support? How do you make it work in Venezuela? And
Yeah.
I'm asking for like the podcast. I'm also asking just for me is like, how do you do it so that I can copy
Yeah.
and try to support it?
Well, we actually had to pause our programs right now in Venezuela because of the issue of getting money in, because it's such a risky situation with the sanctions from the United States on Venezuela. Every month was like, oh my gosh, is this legal? You know, like running it through so many lawyers. Like, is this legal? Is this a better option? It is extremely difficult. And I have other friends that are a very large organization that work mostly in war zones, but I also took them to Cucuta because after I went a few times, it was like, people have to see this. This is overwhelming, unbelievable. Cannot believe this is happening. Can't believe, you know, the UNHCR and places like that are not helping these immigrants. And so anyways, I took them down there and they started programs within Venezuela also, but they've also had to pause their programs, and they're, you know, very well known, recognized organization working in a lot of pretty sketchy countries. And it's extremely difficult. Now, the other thing that's hard about working in Venezuela is one, the sustainability, and one, the instability. So many people are like, yes, I'm staying. I'm going to, you know, I'm never going to leave my country. Venezuelans have a lot of pride for their country and their nationality. And they're like, I'm staying. I want to, you know, build this program with you and, you know, all of these things. And then 2 months later, they leave. They're like, I have to migrate. You know, I can't be here anymore. My kids can't survive. And it's not just needing food for their kids to survive. It's the breakdown of society that has happened with the dictatorship. It's the breakdown of the education system. It's the breakdown of the justice system. It's the breakdown of communities because so many people have left. It's the breakdown of trust between families and friends and communities because so many people are so desperate. Crime has gone through the roof. A lot of people, I don't want to say everybody, a lot of people are in survival mode. And so the like systematic breakdown of society within Venezuela is what has made it really challenging for us. And so we decided to pause our programs, one for that, but also because we started noticing a lot of trends about the Venezuelan women and children leaving Venezuela, being trafficked into Colombia, and then kind of ending up in Ecuador. And I think that that's just geographical. You know, it's like Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador. It's just the next country down. And we started seeing in some of the cities we're in Ecuador, just whole neighborhoods, Venezuelan migrant 20-year-olds working in the brothels, you know, and it just kind of like has transformed this area. One of the cities we're working in Ecuador is there's a couple different kind of red light districts, which is where the girls, you know, stand out on the street. And 90% of them are 20 to 25-year-old Venezuelan girls. And their story is the same. I left because I was desperate. You know, I was, you know, recruited in Colombia and then I had to get away from them. Or another common story that we hear is that they were actually recruited in Venezuela, told there was a job for them in Ecuador. So they had to work their way through Colombia, get to Ecuador. But when they got to Ecuador, they were put in these brothels that are technically legal in this one municipality in the northern border of Ecuador. And then they had to work their debt off to be able to get out of the brothels. And so once they work off, you know, forced prostitution, trafficking, this debt, they are able to leave. But at this point, they're so traumatized, so, you know, receive so much abuse, been in survival mode, have PTSD. Now they're leaving with all of these things. They feel like they can't do anything else but work in prostitution. And so they go down to southern Ecuador and then they, you know, work in these red light districts. And so because of these trends that we were seeing is why we decided to kind of pause our programs in Venezuela for now and really focus on creating direct support services for victims in Ecuador.
Well, tell me about Ecuador. I know that that's probably what people see most often when they see like the United Justice on social media is what you guys have going in Cuenca. Is that the
yeah
okay.
Yeah, down in Cuenca.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Yeah, so we did we really focused a lot on outreach for about a year before we decided to really plant some programs, because we wanted to listen and learn. What are the stories? What is happening? What is going on? How can we best support you? And we really decided that building a resource center that is kind of like a one-stop shop for resources and help would be the best initial program. And so we spent about another year looking for a place. Nobody wanted to rent to us because of the population we were working with. It was so hard to find somebody to rent to us. And then we found a place. It was great location. And then we had to raise the funds to remodel it and furnish it. And so that was all a process. Everything was really thought through, like what we wanted to make a beautiful space that felt peaceful and welcoming, and where they feel loved and with community, but also where they can access legitimate resources. And so we call it the Resource Center, which is kind of like a model of would be a drop-in center in the United States. But we've done pop-up clinics. We've had gynecologists come in and do a 2-day pop-up clinic. We do access to medical care for their kids, and nutritionists that came and, weighed the kids and see who's malnourished and come up with a plan for them. We do crochet classes, which is one of the most popular programs. I was like, they are not going to come to crochet, and they love it. So we do that every Monday. And then we do small business type trainings, hey, it's so much easier, as in Latin America, to just open a business, or, open a little restaurant. And so it's been a lot of connecting one-on-one, building community. They come, they eat, they take a nap. We get to know them. We're building community and connection, and then learning what are your dreams? What can we help you do to get out of the situation that you're in, while also getting them, psychological help and therapy and those things. Then we also at the center, 3 days a week, we have it's called the Educate for Change program. And that's for the children of the survivors. And that's just access to formal education. One of the things that we really encounter a lot in Ecuador is a lot of these women working in the brothels and in the red light districts can't read and write. And they didn't even finish, middle school equivalent. And now their kids are also not in school. And so for us, that was a huge red flag for us to say, okay, to stop this cycle, we really need to intervene in the education for their children. And so we have a teacher on staff down at the Resource Center in Ecuador that she teaches and tutors once they get in school. So the majority of the kids have never been to school. So we're talking about 7, 8, 9, 10, 14, 15-year-olds that have never been to school. And so to be able to get into public school in Ecuador, you have to take a test. You have to meet the grade standard on your test, and then you can get into school. And so we work with them to get them to be able to pass the test so that then they can get into school. And then once they get into school, they come to the center 3 days a week to get help and tutoring with their homework and what they're learning.
Dang, that's awesome.
It's ambitious.
I didn't think you guys did all that. How often do you go down to Ecuador?
I go a few times a year. So with what's happening with Mexico is making it a lot less, because, we have the team down there, we have staff down there, and I was going down a lot more in the beginning to get things established and going, but they've kind of, our teacher's been, Jessica, she's been so amazing. She's taken so much ownership over it, and she's just, taking so much responsibility for the programs. And so I'm just letting them roll with it for now. So I just go a couple times a year. And then in between those trips, I'm making a lot more trips into Mexico, which we'll talk about later.
Well, tell us about, you opened it up. So let's talk about Mexico. I think especially since I've known you, I think I've known you for 3 years now. And I've kind of seen you, I met you and you were really just tied in with Venezuela, just working so often, so much with that population, so much. And then I saw you Ecuador, how much you invest in Ecuador, what you guys are doing down there. I'm not saying you have favorites or anything, but I know that the place you go down most often is definitely Mexico. And when we open up conversation about Mexico, I think those are our conversations that go on the longest, and they're probably the most detailed. And so Like, tell me like about Mexico. Like, what about Mexico kind of stole your heart? What keeps you going
Oh,
back?
Mexico.
And you are involved with some really heavy stuff in Mexico.
Yeah,
So let's hear it. The floor
yeah,
is yours, Christina.
Mexico. Yeah, Mexico is like, Mexico keeps me up at night, that's for sure. I actually started going to the border of the US. So we're working in a couple different places in Mexico. So Jalisco, which is southwestern, and then up in Juarez, which is on the borders, El Paso. But I started going to the border when the Venezuelans started arriving. It was really interesting because the Venezuelans had been moving around and migrating all over, South America for years. And I remember being down there a lot in Colombia thinking like, oh, they're going to go, it's like, oh, I've been to Chile, I've been to Peru, I'm going here, I'm going there, as you know, they're, all over the place. I would think like, oh, they'll never make it to like the States or to Mexico. And it was kind of, because the Darien Gap, the jungle that's there between Colombia and Panama, and just that geographically it's so far. And so when I started reading reports that it was like tens of thousands of Venezuelans showing up at the US border, I was like, what? No way. So I went on my first like exploratory trip there about a year and a half ago to the border. I just wanted to meet people and be like, I mean, honestly, I was shocked. I was just like, how did you get here? Like, how long did it take you? What did you go through to get all the way up here? Which really reminded us of the desperation of the issue in Venezuela. And I mean, it was crazy, the stories we heard. It was, thousands and thousands of Venezuelans, like walking for months. They go through 9 different countries, going through the jungle. The stories about them passing through the jungle was absolutely horrific. But one of the sad things was like, oh, they would say, oh, Nicaragua was bad, Honduras was bad, Guatemala was bad. But Mexico is when I was raped, I was robbed, I was kidnapped. And it was so, I mean, I have such a deep love for Mexico and the other work that we're doing in Jalisco. It was really, I mean, it's just so heartbreaking because Mexicans in Mexico are some of the most incredible, hospitable, kind people on the planet. But they also have just, I mean, some of the worst of humanity in Mexico, and the things that they do to people and the gangs and the criminal cartels. And it's just absolutely shocking, the things that these people go through. And so one of the organizations we partner with on the border also has a program in Tapachula, which is down by the Guatemalan Mexican border. And they've been trying to get me to go there for a year. So hopefully next year I'll be able to make it there. But they're saying, it's such a difference when we meet the migrants at the southern border. They're full of hope. They're excited. They really feel like, they're going to be able to make it and maybe get a job on the way through in Mexico. But by the time we see them at the US Mexico border, they are so traumatized. They are so abused. They are so hurt. They are hopeless. They are manipulated, they are taken advantage of. And so that was really like, oh, okay, those are my type of people. I like to go where nobody else is going, to work with the people that nobody else is working with, and then to even think about the mass vulnerability these women and children have by the time they're in these border cities. Was, to me, it was like an alarm, like, this is an emergency, we need to do something here. And so we started doing trainings in the shelters for migrants, for women and children, that were like, just straight up, this is trafficking. This is what it looks like. This is, they're going to offer you a job. The job is not real. If they offer you to do this or that, or all of these things. And one, I'm like, okay, I shouldn't have been surprised, looking back, but also in the moment was so heartbreaking. One time I was in a room doing it with, I don't know, maybe 45 women at a shelter, and more than half of them had already been victims of trafficking, but they didn't have the language to put to it. And so it was like, they just start breaking down and crying in the trainings and are like, well, this happened to me, but I didn't know that it was trafficking, and this is how I had to escape to be able to get to the next country or to the next city. And so we're working really hard to, I mean, I don't know how I accidentally find myself in these pretty sketchy border situations, but borders are hard to work on because people are moving. They're they're not there to stay. So that was one of the things that was really hard in Cucuta, was like, they're here, they're gone, new group comes in, they're gone, they're here for a few days. And so there's just this like specific amount of time that we have with them to try to empower them and educate them and inform them as much as possible in the time frame that we have them. And some of them decide to stay. Some of them decide to go back. I mean, it's definitely difficult, but we are also pushing into some local communities in Juarez also to bring resources and education and empowerment to the local community as well. That's something that was really interesting to me when we first started going there, was how much vulnerability there is in these local communities and local neighborhoods in Juarez that are really go unseen because the migrants take all the attention. You know, they're on the news, they're with the policies. It's like, this administration does this and this, you know, and it's always changing. Every time I go there, there's new policies, there's new rules, there's new situation. It's a different type of crisis with the migrants, but that takes all the attention. And so then you have these, you know, kids living in poverty that are just so easily recruited into trafficking nightmares, and nobody ever sees them again. It's just this absolute crisis going on in Mexico with these disappearances, which is what we're kind of working on in Jalisco.
You told me the story once, it just kind of like stuck with me. I think it was early this year or last year, but you talked about going with mothers to go and like look into like mass graves, looking to locate some of the missing women and girls that are there in Mexico. And like, I just like, that just seems like such a, like, you know, you read those stats all the time of like, that comes out from the different news outlets of the violence against women and children in Mexico. But having you explain it to me like that, it just made it so much more real, because I knew someone that had went with those mothers to do that. And so like, tell me about that. Tell me about what you're doing in Jalisco. Tell me about like as much as you can, obviously, what's going on in Jalisco, what's behind the numbers and the stats and the disappearances, why it's happening, and what United Justice is doing to help in whatever way that you can.
Yeah, man, this is another, we accidentally fell into this also. This is a common theme. You're probably like, I go somewhere to do one thing and then I'm like, oh, accidentally in the presence of these parents looking for their children. Now, I was actually, United Justice was contracted to go down and do trainings for the prosecutor's office, judges, lawyers, police detectives, investigators, social workers, on the reality of trafficking, how to identify victims of trafficking within the justice system. And then also in the afternoon, we did a trauma training, trying to help them understand why she doesn't know the whole story, why she can't tell it in chronological order, like the actual effects of trauma on the brain. And so we did this 2-day training in Guadalajara. And the second day, we were introduced to a woman, and she was like, you know, the lady that was introducing us was saying, you know, I can't believe you're here. Thank you so much for being here. And then she introduced us. And when the woman walked away, the lady that introduced us was like, man, she's so brave to be here. So I'm like, you know, who was she? And she said that her child has been missing for 15 years, that he was disappeared. And she's been looking for him ever since. So I'm like, what do you mean? And so she was like, oh no, there's so many missing people in Mexico as a whole, but the most are in Jalisco. So I'm like, okay, what is, you know, like, tell me what you're talking about here. And she said there's so many, it's boys and girls that are being, I mean, we call them forcibly disappeared because it's not kidnapped, it's a different type of kidnapping, so we call them enforced disappearances. Normally enforced disappearance is when the military, the police, somebody within the government is involved, but in the law, it says that if they're complicit, they're involved. So this is why we call them disappearances. And so, anyways, through this conversation with this woman, she says, oh no, there's so many here. The parents form, they call them colectivos, which are groups within, like they form these groups, and then on the weekends they get like intel and information about mass graves, and then they go out and dig in these mass graves looking for their children's bodies or some sign of bodies out there. So of course I was like, what are you talking about? Like, what? So we threw together, not knowing what I was getting myself into, just an impromptu. So of course my heart immediately is like, we need to support these parents. They're mostly women. The Mexican government does not investigate it. So they do all of the investigation, they do all of the searching. They're threatened, they come up missing, they eventually, like they've been killed before. It's all of these things. So I'm like, okay, we're here. She was in the training, like let's put together a beautiful breakfast for them on the weekend, because the training was during the week. So we, order a caterer, and we rent this really beautiful space outside. And it was really like, oh, I just want to, bless them. We're here in their city. I can't even imagine what they're going through, and we wanted to just, support them how we could. And it was like, let's just throw something nice for them, with no expectation at all. So we go into this, I'm like smiling and so happy, and this beautiful space and this beautiful food, and they're there, and they were so grateful. And there was, I can't remember how many there were. I want to say maybe 25, all women and one dad. So all moms and one dad. And I'm just like explaining who United Justice is and what we do in anti-trafficking work. And we just wanted to bless you guys, and, just like no big deal. And so, I mean, it was great. It was lots of small talk. They felt really comfortable. A few of them said like, it's so nice to just be served for once, because they were like, we just running around from place to place doing all this work every day. And so it's so nice to just be able to relax. But then after about an hour, one started opening up, and then another started opening up. And then it turned into hours of story after story. I cried. I mean, I cried for days afterwards, but I cried through I have never heard anything like this in my entire life. It gives me chills just thinking about the experience. But it was about, they would say, my daughter was walking home, and she was walking home from school, and she just literally vanished, and I've never seen her again. And, they get contact with people, and they do so much, and they go to the Mexican government, the Fiscalia, which is their prosecutor's office. They don't do anything. They don't investigate. They don't look for them. And there's such a small window of time to find these people alive, or before they're shipped off to different parts of Mexico. And when you look at like the protests and things, it's a lot more pictures of men and boys missing than girls, except stats show it's a lot more girls that are missing. But because of the machismo and the patriarchal culture in Mexico, the women and girls are just not looked for like the men and boys are. But normally the men and boys are, sold into trafficking, like doing drugs. A lot more are kidnapped when they're cosecha. How do you say that in English? Harvest season. When it's like harvest season for the poppy plants and the cocoa plants, and then they're forced into that, and then they're killed. And then a lot of the women are forced into trafficking, like sex trafficking, prostitution, shipped to the northern border into brothels. And like, I mean, there's so much that we don't know about it because the government does not investigate it even to begin with. And these families are the sole investigators and people looking for their own children. One of the women was telling the story. All four of her kids have been disappeared at different times. It was like one, and then a couple years later, another one, a couple years later, another one. Another lady was saying that she'd been looking in mass graves for 7 years for her son. She's dug up over 90 mass graves. She told a story about she was with her friend when her friend found her daughter. They were both digging in a grave, and they found her friend's daughter. And there was one dad that was there that I've actually become really good friends with. And at the time, his son had only been missing for 6 months. And so his son was in his house. at 5 a.m. in the morning, the Fiscalia, which is like the police, it's the prosecutor's office, but they also kind of do what they want. Kicked in the door, took him and another girl in from the house that they were in. Son's 19 years old. Take him, it was like this whole big chaotic, like they kick in the door, oh my God. And it was like they say they were there for somebody else, but that somebody else wasn't there. So they took his son anyways. They took him to jail. He had called his dad and said, Dad, I'm getting arrested, whatever, whatever. So Dad said, oh my God, I'll be right down there. So they took him to the local jail. They book him in. Dad goes. Dad says, why did you arrest my son? Like, he has not done anything wrong. He didn't do anything. He's not, they justify all these things like, oh, they're hanging out with the wrong crowd or all of these things as if that equals being disappeared. But his son was not doing any of that. They say, oh, he kind of got beat up in the process of being arrested and he's in the nurse, like he's in the doctor's office at the jail. So come back tomorrow and we'll let you know what's going on. So of course he's like so worried all night, goes back the next day and they're like, what are you talking about? We don't have anybody here by that name. It's been 2 years and they've never heard anything from him. Like police, the government hasn't investigated anything, not looking for him. So anyways, when we're doing this breakfast in the beginning, his son had only been missing for 6 months. And, I didn't even know what to say at the end of these hours of listening to their stories. And so many stories of girls just ran, walking home, walking to the store and just literally never seen again. Like, but to me, what was so infuriating is the police aren't even doing anything. They like, you have to investigate, you have to look for them, and then on top of that, they're allowing these parents to have to not only investigate, but then investigate where these mass graves are. And then they go out and dig. Like what? It never just like absolutely blew my mind. I lost my train of thought on that one. Because I went back, I was with them there and what was I going to say about the so when we're in the breakfast, I at the end it's like I don't even know what to say, and I'm like, United Justice wants to help. How do we help? Like it doesn't even feel like there's anything that we could possibly do in this situation. Like how can we help you? And the dad said, to be honest with you, we need more shovels. We need shovels and we need bottled waters and we need sandwiches so that when we go out on Saturdays in these graves, that the ground is really hard and it breaks the shovels it was so shocking to me that it was like, that's what you need, like how is this possible, And so we've, over the last year and a half since then, I've become really good friends with the dad. He's running this colectivo. They have 154 parents are a part of the colectivo that are searching for their children, but he's a lawyer. He's an international lawyer, actually. And he's pushing to change laws in Jalisco, laws in Mexico. He's absolutely incredible. Like in the middle of looking at mass graves and putting on protests and going to the governor's office and camping outside the governor's office. He's, writing legislation and trying to get laws passed and training for prevention, and just this absolutely incredible parent just desperately searching and trying to help the issue. I came back from this trip, and the day after that, I applied myself for an international human rights law program, a master's program, because I was so overwhelmed by the issue and, been working in anti-trafficking 13 years in so many different countries and worked with hundreds of survivors. But I was shocked and stuck. Like I have no idea what to do about this, but we have to do something. And even as the bigger, anti-trafficking community, anti-trafficking movement, this is something we need to know about is happening. We also need to come up with some solutions to it. And so, I'm in my second year of my master's program at Oxford, And that's what I'm writing this year, my dissertation, and I'm focusing on the crisis of enforced disappearances in Jalisco. And the stuff that I have already found in my research is just, I mean, the numbers are so big, it's hard to even like grasp, like you were saying in the beginning, it's like you throw out these statistics and these numbers are so big, but it's so hard to like humanize like what is actually happening here and who is really affected. And it's overwhelmingly proven that these kids are sold into or given into or wrapped up into these massive criminal trafficking networks. And I think we need to bring a lot more awareness, and we need to put a lot more support into these families that are the sole investigators and searchers for their children. So yeah, that's how I accidentally also got involved in Jalisco.
Well, that leads me to a couple of questions. You mentioned where to even start with this. I guess first thing is like what's the solution to like what you're saying in Mexico of like I remember when we first met, we first bonded because you had mentioned that you were a big fan of Narcos. And I'm a big fan of Narcos. Narcos Mexico and Narcos Colombia. That's how we kind of like, you're a fan.
Narcos Colombia is the best, though.
Oh, it's so
Narcos
good.
Colombia is the best.
It is.
Yeah.
It's yeah, yeah. And I remember I was like, okay, this is a good person. Like it's in the same kind of TV shows I am. Kind of expose himself to like the same type of stuff, and we had a discussion a long time ago on just like what is a solution in Mexico, what can be done. Is there's a need to be like a military intervention, or what is a solution? And you said something to me that I've used in a couple different presentations. I've bastardized it. I've taken and kind of applied it to like you. I'll back up. You mentioned that you said so when I got an award a couple months ago from the Colombian government, and I said that I was so humbled to be a foreigner receiving this award because I know how much Colombia has suffered because of American citizens, because of the American addiction to cocaine and now the American addiction to sex. And I stole that from you because during like the height of these protests and the politicalization of the border, you had mentioned that none of this would be happening, or at least not to the extent that it is, if the United States didn't have such a demand for sex, and even more so, such a demand for fentanyl, for cocaine, for drugs. So like, I guess what is the solution to like to stop all this violence like in Mexico in your opinion, as like an Oxford student that's studying this, like what is your thought? Is it just like a lost battle, or is it what is the solution?
Lost battle does come up a lot. And, sometimes I'm like, oh, Mexico's hopeless. Like, what are we going to do? It's just so, but I'll get to that in a minute. It is an interesting thing being a foreigner in these countries because of the role, like when you really look into the history of how all of this stuff started in these Latin American countries and the demand that just sucks this stuff out of the addiction to sex, the addiction to drugs, but also foreign policy. It's like none of this stuff would be happening if, foreign policy wasn't as ridiculous as it is, or how it's rooted in the benefit of the United States. Foreign policy and foreign aid and all of that is not for the benefit of the country that it's going to, in my opinion. It is for the benefit of the United States. And so with that, I feel a level of responsibility as an American to go down there and try to fix the problem somehow. I mean, like, I know I can't fix the problem, or even United Justice, but I have this conviction inside of I want to be a part. I want to stand alongside the Mexican citizens that are fighting, that are digging, that are looking, that are investigating, that are changing laws, because I do feel a sense of responsibility as an American, because it wouldn't happen if it wasn't for the Americans. And Porfirio Diaz was a dictator from a long time ago in Mexico, but he said something he said something really interesting. It's a quote that I might butcher because it was in Spanish, but it's he said, poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States. And it was like, oh, like that's the problem with Mexico. And I often think, like, what would Mexico be if it didn't border the US? Like, what could it be and what could it achieve if it didn't border the United States? And is the United States the biggest thing that's wrong with Mexico? And so I feel a sense of responsibility. I think a lot of Americans need to step up in their responsibility and standing up for Latin America and standing up for the damage that we've done in so many Latin American countries. I mean, then you get into Central America, and that's a whole nother issue of what the United States has created there. But I think, one of the problem in Mexico comes down to corruption. The corruption is so
Right.
deep within the government that you can't do law reform. I really feel like if there is a solution for Mexico, it needs to be an outside entity, which I know all of this is very controversial and would be very difficult. Like, how do you even do that? Who decides who is it? But like, say, for example, like the UN builds a anti-Mexican corruption or anti-corruption, division for Mexico, and an outside entity that has no connection with the government or the security forces within Mexico needs to come in and vet and get rid of people and get new people and set up a system. And I know that sounds like, oh, that sounds so easy and great in theory. So many things could go wrong with that, right? Like, it's like, oh, the US trying to build democracy in Afghanistan. What could go wrong? It's like the same type of concept. But I think that's one of the only solutions because they're so involved. The government, the military, the police, the security forces are all so intertwined with the cartels and the narco trafficking and the human trafficking and it is very complicated, the issue in Mexico. Very complicated. But at the end of it, it's like you have these poor moms digging in graves. So it's hard to be like, okay, it's too complicated. I can't do anything about it. Or these issues on the border with all the migrant, it's just, it comes down to like, but it's humanity, but they're actually living, breathing, eating people. These are people. And I know that issues very complicated, but how can we just help the one person and support, bring in some sort of change eventually. So,
Well, I appreciate your thoughts on that. I wanna change topics just a little bit.
yep.
As we come to the end of this podcast, there's one more topic that I think is really important for I think myself to listen to, other people that may listen to this, may learn from. It's the concept of survivor leadership.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you had mentioned earlier that you're a survivor, and I was going to let you bring that up. I was going to bring that up, so you did it. So thanks for opening the
yeah.
door for that. And
Yeah.
so I'm just curious of like when it comes to survivor leadership, I know so many organizations want to do it right.
Hmm.
I feel like some do it right, some do it wrong with good intent and end up doing more damage than good. And I'll never forget a conversation that you had with me maybe like a year ago when you talked about that you support survivors who actually feel like they can't get out of the movement, that they decide to become activists, they decide to speak on behalf of organizations, and it's so traumatizing to them, but the money's too good and they can't get out and they don't know what else to
Yeah.
do, which sounds an awful lot like, their lived experience of being
Yeah.
trafficked. So like I guess like that me like spewing my thoughts there of like how can organizations, how do we do better at survivor leaderships? What are we doing well? What can survivors do? And what advice would you give to survivors that may, I ask this, because there's some survivors that we work with at Libertas who are really awesome survivors that want to become activists, I guess. And I'm
Mhm.
really hesitant to support
Yeah.
it, but also I don't want to take away their voice. And So anyway, I'm gonna
Yeah.
leave that all to you and let you kind of decipher everything that I just blurted out.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm so passionate about this topic because I've been in this long enough to see like the evolution of survivors. So like in the beginning, it was like we were excluded from everything. Nobody even really cared because it was all these, organizations, doing it. And then it was like survivors kind of had to fight for their voice within the movement. And then we were kind of like used, it was like, I can't tell you how many times I've told my story at fundraisers, and then eventually it was like, you're using my story to make money. It's like, do I feel good about this? But more impact, I've always been really good at keeping boundaries around myself and saying no and doing what I wanted and not doing what I didn't because I had other passions and I have kids. And so I've always been so passionate about being a mom and I wanted to be a good mom. And so a lot of my focus and energy was on that in the beginning. And I didn't throw myself 100% into anti-trafficking as a survivor leader. But it's been really interesting for me because I am friends with almost the majority of like the main survivor leaders that you see and hear and that are making so much change and transformation, but behind the scenes a lot of the people that I have, survivor leaders that I've known and supported along the years, are dying behind the scenes. They're reliving, their keynote speakers all over the place and doing this and doing that, but they're constantly reliving the worst thing that ever happened to them. So I would always be like, but why don't you just do something else? And it was almost like it was impossible for them. Like you said, the money was too good. We went from being ignored to being used to then being paid really well. Like I have been offered ridiculous amounts of money to go tell my story. And I understand the motive behind that. Like you want to honor it, you want to show the value behind it. I'm also not for sale, so it's like no matter how much you offer me, if I don't want to speak at your fundraiser or your gala, I'm not going to do it. But a lot of survivors are not in that position to be able to say no. They are now making their living off of telling their story while they have to relive this over and over and over again. And I always really even fought in the beginning, which I don't care now, but like, I mean, now we have so many different names like lived experience and survivor leader, all of these things. But in the beginning, it was like, I do not want to be labeled a survivor because I'm not going to allow the movement to reduce me down to the worst thing that happened to me and put me in that box. I am so many other things. And so I think for those of us working with survivors that do direct services, that have direct contact, my biggest advice for organizations is we need to understand as the organizations that our goal is to not get them out to tell their story or to be an activist or to start their own organization. Our goal is to be able to give them enough resources and help and exit services so that they can be what they would have been if they were never trafficked to begin with. That's the goal. And so for a lot of organizations, the success is, oh, how many survivors do you have on staff? I'm like, I'm the only one. And that's the way I want it. And maybe if an opportunity comes up for a survivor and she wants the job, that's fine. But my goal is to fill my staff positions with survivors. That my goal is for them to do what they would have done to be able to get to a place of healing and hope and education and opportunity to do what they would have done if they were never trafficked to begin with. And I like I said, I used to tell my story a lot, and well-meaning people would come up to me afterwards and say, "Oh, you're so amazing. Your story is so amazing. You went through this so that you could free others." And I understand the sentiment behind that, but there was something always so wrong with, and I'd be like, I'd be so nice, thank you so much. I really appreciate, because I understand they're trying. Yeah, it's hard. What do you say to someone after they tell a story like that, but it used to bother me so much. And I remember thinking one day, like, okay, I got to figure this out. Why is it bothering me? And it really came down to, I don't think it's fair that I had to go through all of that, then work my
You can
butt
swear.
off.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. I was like, what is the other word for that? To work my ass off to get healing, to get to a place where I could live a normal life. And now the burden of ending trafficking is on me. It's like, that's not fair. And that's what we're doing to these survivors when we say things like that. But when we also like, okay, you're great, you're out of exploitation, you've gotten some healing, I have a job for you in anti-trafficking. That's the message we're giving them. And for me, it bothers me so much in the survivor leader movement that they're like, we should be leading it, we should be doing this. And I'm always telling them also, no, we need people. To me, the heroes are people like you that have not been through it, that are still giving their life to this absolute tragedy. It's like those are the people I think those people within society are the ones that should be responsible for ending it. I feel like if I get to a point where I'm like, I'm done, I don't want to hear about this anymore, I don't want to see the situation anymore, I don't want to give advice anymore, I would hope that the greater anti-trafficking community would support that as much as they support me as being a survivor leader. So, I think I could probably go on and on about this for so long, but I do want to say though, like you mentioned, the girl that Libertas works with, it could be a stepping stone in our journey. I think it's in our journey of healing. There is a point where it feels empowering to share the story and feel the reaction from people. It inspires people, it educates people, it empowers people, it helps bring clarity to this like confusion around anti-trafficking work and like what is going on and who are the victims and who are the pimps. It's like, and it brings it down. But just like we were talking about with Mexico, it also humanizes it. Like, this is a human being that this is happening to. How can we not do something about it? So it can be a part of the journey. It's when there has to be an exit strategy for her. Like, say maybe she becomes an activist and she does some stuff. What is the next step? Like what happens after she is the activist and brings so much transformation and hope and healing to her own communities where she was trafficked, making sure that they don't get stuck there. So, yeah.
Well, this is why it's so nice that we connect, because every time I talk to you, I feel like I learned so much, and you're just so much knowledge, and it's come out of your experiences, and especially like in that last question I asked, and your response just so. I'll never forget, like, one time you corrected my thinking once. It really had an effect on me in such a good way. And then I've just had survivors continue to just reinforce that fact where you said, I said something once where I was talking about a survivor, and you were like, yeah, her ultimate, she's healing so she can one day, speak or heal others or do whatever. And you were like, that's awesome. But I think you need to shorten down like that, what you just said, she's healing because she deserves to heal and because she's a person. Yeah. Period. End of discussion. Like, not like so she can be a or she can be a lawyer, she can speak on behalf of the organization, so she can do whatever. It's like, nope, she deserves to heal. End of sentence.
That's it. That's it. Like, she deserves to heal because of what she went through. And that's what we're doing here.
Yeah, you corrected me on that. I said it in such an innocent way, I'm sure, like with no, but like that was just what my thinking back then.
Yeah.
And you helped correct it, just like, yeah, like that'd be awesome. If this survivor wants to heal, so one day she can heal others, then great. Like, applaud her and super excited for her. But also, if the survivor she wants to heal, she deserves to heal. End of story. Like, so she can go work at Burger King.
And we should be celebrating that just as much.
Yes.
Just as much. Yes, exactly. She can work at Burger King. She can work and we need to celebrate that, because it's not about her getting healing to then go do something. It's about her getting healing because she deserves it.
Yeah. And I think it's such an empowering, like, I'm so thankful that you corrected me on that and you called me out on that, because, there's a survivor that, leads.
I'm sure I did it nicely, though.
You did. It was super nice. You super nice. But the the survivor that sits on my board, she told me something very similar, which was like her being a survivor, she was like, that's like number 7 on my list of things that are important to me. Where it's like my identity
Yeah.
foremost as an entrepreneur. She's like, that's what I do. I've got this pet store. I'm an entrepreneur by trade, and then I'm a mother. I'm very proud of like the kids that
Yeah.
I'm raising. I'm a board member of your organization, but I don't use that title as a survivor. I'm using it as a volunteer. I'm a volunteer. That's what
Yeah.
part of my identity. And she went down like this list of things, and she was like, "Yeah, I'm a survivor of trafficking, but it's like number 7 on my list. And I want my identity to be placed in that," which I thought was incredibly healthy for her, and all these things that she's accomplishing to not make it like the focal point of her identity, so that she can, um, so just for that label in herself, like I'm super proud of her for even like
Yeah.
vocalizing that and naming that, and with your story as well. Like we've we're running out of time here on the podcast, but this your story's so you're so like it's so amazing. Like you talk about like all these labels that could have been put on you of like victim, prisoner, entrepreneur, activist, like all these
Yeah.
different things, student. But for me, like
Yeah.
I think the label that I would label you as just a friend and a mentor. I think like
Oh,
everything else, like
thanks.
all the amazing things you're doing, like your friendship, your mentorship, your knowledge, your partnership, your companionship. I remember I called you once just in a panic or something that was happening, and you spoke truth into me. You helped me come back, like, and center myself, and of all the labels that could be put on you, the one that I think means the most to me is just friend and mentor. And so I guess just thank you
Thank
for
you.
everything that you do, and I'm just so thankful that you would take 2 hours out of your day to be on the podcast. And we got about 4 minutes left before the our timer runs out. Do you have anything else to add that I may have missed on the pod?
No, I'm so thankful to be here, and it's really nice of you. But that's one of the things that I tell people also. A lot of people know about you and Libertas and in my circles as well, but always like, oh, my friend Tyler. Oh, he also runs an organization. But from the very beginning, it's been really awesome to build a friendship with you and have a connection with you. I mean, you've supported United Justice and brought in support for United Justice and projects that we've been doing since the very beginning. And you never wanted anything in return for that, which is really rare in this work also. And so from the beginning, I knew that you were the real deal, that you were really genuine and you really care about the issue, but more so of the girls. And even when you tell me stories about them, I can just see your face light up. It just comes from the heart. And we definitely need more Tylers in this work because it's really hard to come across men that are genuine and pure and committed and dedicated. And so I'm just so grateful for you and Libertas and everything that you're doing. I'm here, I'm available. Anything I could ever do to help, I'm always here.
You're the best, Christina. I did not pay her for that, so just FYI, I did not. I'm not going to Venmo her. That just came. Yeah,
Yeah.
so kind of you. Thanks, Christina. I'll link in the show notes everything to do with United Justice. Hopefully, you get some support your way. The link to your Instagram, your website, and man, just thank
Yeah,
you for
that'd be
the
great.
time. And I know you have another meeting coming up here in a bit, and I'm sure your kids need some mom time. So just God bless you. Love you so much, and just thank you so much for spending
Thank
time with
you.
me.